He didn't even bother to knock. Augustus Rourke walked into the courtroom like he owned it, because for 20 years he had owned everything that mattered in 3 territories. He dropped a leather folder onto the defense table, leaned toward his attorney, and said loud enough for the gallery to hear, "Bury her. Use the father. Use all of it." He didn't look at Lenora once. That was the part that hit hardest. Not the threat, not the money behind it. The fact that he couldn't even grant her the dignity of being worth his gaze. A woman who had crossed 1,000 miles, survived a mountain winter, and handed investigators 4 years of evidence that was about to end his empire. She was nothing to him, a loose end, a bookkeeper who forgot her place. And that right there is the moment this story truly begins. If you've ever been told you were too small, too quiet, too ordinary to matter, stay with me. Because what Lenora Bellamy did next will make you question every time you ever stayed silent. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss a story like this one. And drop a like, then tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all started. The letter almost didn't get sent. Rhett Calloway wrote it on a Tuesday night in late October, sitting at a table that needed 2 books shoved under one leg to keep from rocking. Fire had burned low. The house smelled like cold ash and old leather, and 3 years of a man living alone in a space that used to hold 2 people. He had a half-eaten plate of beans beside him, a pen that kept skipping, and the particular kind of exhaustion that has nothing to do with the body. He wrote to the agency because Wade had told him to. Wade Hollowell, his only ranch hand, and the closest thing he had to a friend, had made the suggestion at the end of a brutal week when 2 of Rhett's horses had taken sick. The north fence had come down in a windstorm, and they'd discovered rot in 3 of the floor planks near the kitchen. Wade had looked around at the state of the place and said, with the bluntness of a man who doesn't know how to soften things, "You need help, Rhett. Real help. The kind that doesn't go home at night." Rhett had told him to mind his own affairs, but he'd written the letter anyway, kept it short, practical. He said he was a widower, that he ran a cattle operation on the eastern slope of Black Pine Mountain, that the work was hard and the winters were harder, and the nearest town was a 40-minute ride down a switchback trail that turned to ice by December. He said he needed someone who understood that frontier life wasn't romantic. He said nothing about loneliness, because he had convinced himself that wasn't the issue. He sealed the envelope before he could think about it too long. By the time spring came and the agency wrote back confirming a match, Rhett had changed his mind at least 11 times. He didn't tear up the original letter because he had already mailed it. He didn't cancel the arrangement because canceling would have required writing another letter, and by then he was halfway through calving season and didn't have the time or the... He told himself the woman probably wouldn't come. Women from Missouri didn't typically cross 1,000 miles for a man they'd never met who lived on a mountain with no neighbors and a leaky roof. He was wrong about that. The stagecoach from Colson Junction arrived in Black Pine Crossing on a Thursday, which was inconvenient because Rhett had planned to ride into town on Friday for supplies and avoid the whole thing entirely. Wade had other ideas. "You can't let her step off that coach and not be there," Wade said at breakfast, not looking up from his coffee. "She's a grown woman. She's a stranger in a town she's never seen, coming to marry a man she's never met, and you want to just not be there." Rhett didn't answer. "I'll get the wagon ready," Wade said. Rhett went to town. He stood on the wooden sidewalk outside Hargrove's general store with his hat in his hands and his jaw set like he was expecting to be told something unpleasant, which, in a way, he was. He had spent 3 years building a life that required very little of him emotionally. This arrangement threatened that. He'd known it when he sent the letter. He'd chosen not to think about it. The stagecoach came in at 2:30, trailing dust, and the smell of horses worked hard over a long distance. 3 passengers got out, a heavy-set man with a traveling case, an elderly woman with a hat pinned at a difficult angle, and then Lenora. She stepped down without waiting for the driver's help, which was the first thing Rhett noticed. She had dark hair pulled back under a practical hat, a traveling dress that had seen real use, and a trunk that she clearly intended to manage herself before the driver even offered. She stood on the street and looked at Black Pine, crossing the way a person looks at something they've been preparing themselves for, not with wonder, not with disappointment, just with the steady gaze of someone taking accurate inventory. Then she looked at Rhett. He'd been told she would recognize him from the description he'd sent the agency: tall, dark hair going gray at the temples, a scar along his left jaw from a fence wire. Incident 3 winters back. Apparently, the description was accurate enough because she walked toward him without hesitation and stopped at a reasonable distance. "Mr. Calloway," she said. "Miss Bellamy," he said. There was a pause that probably lasted 4 seconds and felt like considerably longer. "I appreciate you coming to meet me," she said. "Seemed right," he said. Another pause. Around them, the small town was doing what small towns do, pretending not to look while looking at everything. Rhett was aware of it. He suspected Lenora was too. "I imagine you have questions," she said. "A few," he said. "Then I suggest we find somewhere to talk before we both say something we can't take back." That was also not what he'd expected. He'd expected nervousness, or the overly eager pleasantness of someone trying very hard to make a good impression. What he got instead was a woman who seemed to be conserving energy for something more important than performing composure. Took her to the diner. They sat across from each other with coffee going cold between them and Rhett trying to figure out where to start. Lenora, he noticed, kept her hands flat on the table. Still, like she was making a deliberate effort not to fidget. "The agency told you about the homestead," he said. "Yes, and the winters." "Yes, and that my wife passed 3 years ago." Something crossed her face at that, not pity. "Exactly. More like recognition." "Yes, I was sorry to read that." He nodded once. Then he said the thing he'd been carrying since he woke up that morning. "I don't know if this was a good idea." She didn't flinch. "Which part?" "Any of it." Lenora looked at him for a moment without speaking. Then she said, "Mr. Calloway, I've been on a stagecoach for 9 days. Before that I was on a train for 4. Before that I spent 3 weeks settling my affairs in Missouri and saying goodbye to the only life I'd ever known." She picked up her coffee cup, looked at it, set it back down. "I didn't come this far for an easy arrangement. I came because the letter you wrote said you needed someone capable. I believe I'm capable. I'd like the chance to demonstrate that before either of us decides this was a mistake." He looked at her for a long moment. "You're not what I expected." "Neither are you," she said, and then quietly, "That might be fine." It wasn't a moment of warmth. It wasn't the beginning of something easy. But there was something in it, some small recognition that they were both tired people who had run out of the energy required for pretending. He told her about the 30 days that same afternoon. What he said, specifically, was, "I'll give you a month. You stay at the Hargrove place in town. Mrs. Hargrove has a room she rents. You come up to the homestead each day and work. At the end of 30 days, we decide." Together, he thought she might argue about the separation of households. She didn't. She said, "That's fair." And then she said something he'd be thinking about for the rest of the week. "I won't pretend I don't hope it works out. But I won't fall apart if it doesn't. I want you to know that." He drove home alone that evening, wondering whether that should reassure him or worry him, and concluding that he genuinely didn't know. She showed up at the homestead at 6 the following morning. He hadn't told her a specific time. He'd assumed she'd arrive mid-morning, like most people new to serious work, needing time to ease in. Instead, she was standing at the gate at 6 o'clock, with her hair already pinned back, and a pair of worn work gloves sticking out of her coat pocket, studying the condition of the water trough with an expression of professional disapproval. "That needs cleaning," she said when he came out. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning. That trough needs cleaning. There's algae built up along the bottom. The livestock have been drinking that water?" "They have." "When did you last scrub it?" He opened his mouth, closed it. "I'll handle it," she said. She was already rolling up her sleeves. He stood there for a moment watching her, which was not something he'd expected to be doing at 6 in the morning. He thought about telling her she didn't need to start with the trough. He thought about explaining that there was a particular order he preferred to do morning chores in. He thought about a lot of things, and then he went and got the scrub brush from the barn and handed it to her without a word. She was faster than he expected, harder working. She didn't ask how to do things. She observed how they were done and then did them. Or if she didn't know, she asked directly, without the performance of embarrassment that most people added around asking for help. She hauled water without complaining about the weight. She fed the livestock and noticed which of the animals were off their feed. She found a weakness in the chicken coop wire that Rhett hadn't gotten to and fixed it with scraps from the barn. By noon, she had done more than Rhett typically accomplished before 2 in the afternoon. He didn't say anything about it, but he noticed. The days developed a kind of rhythm. She came at 6. She worked until the light failed. She rode back to town in the early dark. She never once suggested the arrangement was beneath her, which was what he'd been privately bracing. For the moment when the reality of the work exceeded what she'd imagined and the gradual pull toward leaving began, it didn't happen. If anything, as the days wore on and the physical work stopped feeling new and started feeling like simple repetition, she seemed to settle deeper into it. She fixed the leaking section of roof over the kitchen, not perfectly, but adequately, using materials from the barn and a method she'd apparently learned from a neighbor back in Missouri. She replanted the kitchen garden that Rhett had let go to ruin 2 summers ago, working in the Sorfolds in the evenings when the light was still good and the ground had warmed enough. She mended 3 years of accumulated clothing repairs that Rhett had been meaning to get to and kept meaning. And she did something else, something smaller that he almost missed. She started leaving the kitchen in the morning the way Margaret had left it. Not exactly the same, just tidy, organized in a way that made it feel like a room that was being lived in by someone who intended to stay. He came in one morning, and the dish towels were folded in a way he hadn't seen since before his wife died. Most of its windows were dark, and he stood in the kitchen door for a moment with his chest doing something complicated before he made himself walk in and get on with the day. He didn't mention it. She didn't mention it. But something shifted, somewhere around the 12th or 13th day, that both of them could feel and neither was willing to name. Then he found the box. It was a metal document box, the kind used for keeping papers safe in a fire, wedged at the back of the shelf in the storage room off the kitchen where she'd been keeping her extra things. He wasn't looking for anything. He was hunting for a small hand, saw he thought he'd left in there back in winter. His hand hit the box and it slid forward, and the latch, which apparently hadn't been secured properly, opened, and the papers inside fanned out across the shelf. He caught them before they fell. He shouldn't have read them. He knew that. He told himself to stack them neatly and close the box and put it back where it had been. He read them. They were financial records, detailed ones, column after column of figures with dates and property designations and names that appeared repeatedly: deed transfers, water rights assignments, payments to officials whose positions were listed beside their names. The handwriting was precise and even clearly done by someone trained for accuracy. He recognized it as Lenora's after a few lines. The name Augustus Rourke appeared on nearly every page. He didn't know that name, but the records made clear enough what the name represented. This was a man who had been systematically buying, forging, and stealing property across a significant swath of Missouri for at least 4 years, and Lenora had been documenting it from the inside, tracking every transaction, copying every record, preserving evidence of a fraud operation substantial enough that the figures alone made Rhett's jaw tighten. He stood in that storage room for a long time. When she came in from the barn that evening and found him at the kitchen table with the papers stacked in front of him, she stopped in the doorway. Her face didn't go pale. Her expression didn't crumble. What happened instead was more controlled than that: a careful, total stillness, the kind that belongs to a person who has been preparing for a specific moment and has now arrived at it. How long, he said. 4 years of records, she said. I started keeping copies 18 months before I left. How long have you been planning to come west? Since I realized he knew I'd seen too much. Rhett looked at the papers, then at her, then at the papers again. You used my advertisement. Yes, her voice was level. Not cold, she wasn't cold, but precise. Like she was choosing every word with the same care she'd used on those columns of figures. I needed to disappear. Not just leave. Disappear. A frontier homestead in a mountain settlement no one east of the plains has heard of. That was what I needed. Your letter came through the agency, and I thought, you thought I was useful, he said, a long pause. I thought you were an opportunity, she said. I won't lie to you about that. But I also thought, she stopped. Started again. The letter you wrote. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't trying to be. It said you needed someone capable And you were offering something real in return. I believe that was true. She held his gaze. I still believe that. He didn't speak for a moment. The fire popped. Outside, the wind moved through the pine trees. These people, he said, gesturing to the papers, the families on these deeds, driven off their land. Some of them had nowhere to go. At least 2 men died resisting ruled accidents, both of them. And Rourke is still free. As of when I left Missouri, yes, a beat. I don't know how long it took him to realize I'd gone, or how long after that to figure out where. Rhett sat with that. The full weight of what it meant settled over the kitchen like weather coming in. This wasn't a woman hiding from a difficult past. This was a woman hiding from a man with the money and the motivation to send people to find her. Picked up the papers, set them back in the box. Closed the latch this time properly. Go to bed, he said. We'll talk tomorrow. Rhett, tomorrow, he said. Not unkindly, just with the firmness of a man who needs to think and can't do it with someone watching him. She went. He sat at that table for 3 more hours, staring at the fire and arriving, very slowly, at the only decision that made any sense to him. When he finally went to his own bed, he'd already made it. Anyone coming for Lenora Bellamy was going to have to come through him first. He didn't feel particularly heroic about it. It was just the only acceptable option. He'd figure out the rest in the morning. He didn't sleep much that night. Rhett lay on his back. He'd patched staring at the ceiling, patched twice in 3 years, listening to the wind work its way through the gaps around the window frame, and doing the kind of thinking that feels less like planning and more like being dragged somewhere you're not sure you want to go. He kept coming back to the same thing. Not the documents. Not Rourke's name printed over and over on those columns of stolen property. What kept coming back was the look on Lenora's face when she'd found him at the table. She hadn't been surprised. That was what stayed with him. She hadn't looked caught or panicked or even particularly ashamed. She'd looked like a woman who had been calculating the odds of this exact moment for months and had already decided, somewhere in the back of her careful mind, exactly what she would say when it arrived. That kind of composure didn't come from nowhere. It came from a person who had learned, probably the hard way, and probably more than once, that falling apart in front of other people cost you something you couldn't always get back. He understood that, more than he wanted to admit. By 4 a.m, he gave up on sleeping and went to the kitchen to make coffee. He stood at the window while it came to a boil and looked out at the dark shape of the mountains, against a sky that was just beginning to consider the possibility of morning, and he thought about Margaret. Not with the specific grief that used to knock the air out of him, that kind had softened over 3 years into something duller and more manageable, like a healed break that aches when rain is coming. He thought about her practically, about how she'd been the one who could read a situation and name it without ceremony, who never confused compassion with weakness, who would have looked at the box of documents on that shelf and said, without hesitation, help her, poured his coffee. He was going to help her. The question was how. Lenora arrived at 6, as she always did, which told him something. A woman who'd been found out and wasn't sure of her standing might have arrived late, or tentatively, or with the over-prepared brightness of someone trying to paper over the night before. She arrived at 6, and she arrived the same way she always arrived, work gloves in her coat pocket, hair already sorted, eyes doing a quick inventory of what needed doing before she'd even said good morning. Coffee's on, Rhett said. She came in and poured herself a cup and leaned against the counter and waited. She was good at waiting. He'd noticed that. She didn't fill silence, the way some people did, push a king words into it like they were afraid of what quiet might say. I have questions, he said. All right, Rourke. How much does he know about where you went? She wrapped both hands around the mug. I was careful. I told no one in Missouri where I was going. I paid for the train fare with money I'd saved, separately from my wage account cash. Nothing to trace. I used my mother's name on the first leg of the trip. She paused. But he has resources. And time. If he's motivated enough and patient enough, someone will eventually find a record somewhere. How motivated is he? I took 4 years of evidence that could put him in a territorial prison. She said it flat, without drama. He's motivated. Rhett drank his coffee. Set the mug down. The records, you think they're enough to actually convict him? Every transfer, every forged signature, every payment to a county official, documented with dates. I copied original deeds side by side with the altered versions. I have sworn statements, written ones, from 3 families who were driven off their land. She looked at him steadily. If a territorial court sees those papers and still lets him walk free, then the court is in his pocket. And even then, the evidence exists. It doesn't disappear just because one court ignores it. You planned this carefully. I had time to plan, she said, and not much else to do with it. There was something behind that sentence that she didn't expand on, and he didn't push. But he filed it away, the specific shape of someone who had spent a long time alone inside a situation they couldn't talk about. He pulled out the chair across from him and sat down properly. Here's what I think we need to do. 30 days was the arrangement. 14 of them are gone. I think we skip the rest of the counting and talk to Marshal Shaw. She went still, the local marshal, Everett Shaw. He's been the law in Black Pine Crossing for 11 years. He's not bought. I know because 2 years ago a mining operation tried to get him to look the other way on a claim dispute, and he arrested their foreman for attempted bribery. Rhett watched her face. He's not perfect. He can be slow and he argues about jurisdiction like it's a sport, but he doesn't take money. And if Rourke already has contacts in the territory, then we'll know soon enough. But sitting here waiting for someone to ride up that trail is worse. He met her eyes. You didn't cross 1,000 miles to keep hiding, Lenora. You copied 4 years of records because you wanted it to mean something. She didn't answer right away. She looked down at her coffee, then out the window at the clearing and the pines beyond it, then back at him. If we go to Shaw, she said slowly, and he reaches out to territorial authorities, Rourke will know. Someone will tell him. It always works that way. She wasn't arguing against it, he could tell that. She was thinking out loud, which means the window between telling Shaw and getting any actual protection could be very short. I know, and you're all right with that. I'm all right with stopping being passive about it, he said. That's not exactly the same thing, but it's close enough. She was quiet for another moment. Then she nodded. Once. The way she had of settling decisions, no ceremony about it. Just a shift in her posture that said, all right, we're doing this. When? Today, Rhett said, after chores. Marshal Everett Shaw had an office that smelled like old paper and stale pipe tobacco, which was accurate because that was essentially what it contained. He was a man in his 50s with a thick gray mustache and the particular manner of a person who had seen enough in his life that very little surprised him anymore, though he'd maintained the professional courtesy of occasionally pretending otherwise. He listened to Rhett without interrupting. Then he listened to Lenora, who laid the relevant pages from the document box on his desk and walked him through them with the same efficiency she applied to everything else. When she finished, Shaw looked at the papers for a long moment without touching them. Augustus Rourke, he said. You know the name? Rhett asked. Heard it. Man like that doesn't stay completely quiet even when he's trying to. Shaw picked up one of the deed comparison pages and held it closer to the light from the window. These alterations, you're certain these signatures are forged? I have the originals alongside the altered versions, Lenora said, and a statement from the county clerk's widow in Caldwell County who says her late husband told her 3 months before he died that a man matching Rourke's description paid him to change recording documents. She set that page on top. That's not conclusive on its own. But combined with the financial transfers, combined with all of this, Shaw said it's a significant case. He put the page down, looked at Lenora directly for the first time since she'd started talking. How long have you been in Black Pine Crossing? 2 weeks. And you believe Rourke doesn't know you're here. I believe he doesn't know yet. Shaw drummed his fingers once on the desk. I'm going to need to write to the territorial marshal's office. That's not going to happen overnight. It might not happen in a week. He looked at Rhett. You understand what I'm saying? I understand, Rhett said. I'll do what I can to speed it along. In the meantime, he looked between them. Miss Bellamy, I'd strongly recommend you stay up at the Calloway place rather than in town. Town's easier to watch. The mountain's harder to get to quietly. Lenora said, I had the same thought. Mrs. Hargrove, when told that Lenora needed to stay up at the homestead, for reasons she wasn't at liberty to fully explain, turned out to be both more understanding and more practical than Rhett had expected. She helped pack Lenora's trunk without asking more than 3 questions, then pressed a jar of her blackberry preserves into Lenora's hands and told her to be careful, which landed somewhere between parting advice and genuine affection. The ride back up the mountain that evening was quieter than usual. Lenora sat beside him on the wagon bench with her trunk secured in the back and the document box on her lap, one hand resting on top of it. About halfway up the switchback, she said, "You didn't have to do any of this." "I know that," Rhett said. "I used your advertisement to hide. That's the truth of it. And now you're Nora." He kept his eyes on the trail. "I've thought about what you did. I'm not saying it sits entirely easy with me, because it doesn't. But I've also thought about what it takes to do what you did, 4 years of documentation, walking away from everything you knew, crossing 1,000 miles alone." He was quiet for a moment. "I don't think you're a dishonest person who made convenient choices. I think you're a person who ran out of safe options and took the one available." Another pause. "I'd have done the same." She didn't say anything for a moment. "Then your wife. She would have helped me too, wouldn't she?" He didn't answer right away. The horses worked their way around the last major curve in the trail. The homestead came into view, the dark shape of the cabin, the barn, the new section of roof she'd repaired, all of it sitting under a sky thick with stars. "Yeah," he said finally. She would have. The arrangement changed after that, practically, and in ways that were harder to put words to. Lenora moved into the spare room off the kitchen, the one that had been empty and accumulating used harnesses and old almanacs for 2 years. They cleared it out together one Saturday morning, which involved Rhett discovering 3 things he'd been looking for since the previous winter, and Lenora pretending not to notice when he stood holding a wool scarf of Margaret's for a moment too long before, setting it carefully on the shelf in the main room. She didn't comment on it. He appreciated that more than he could have explained. The room got a bed, a small table, a lamp. Most of its windows were dark, and the rug from the storage room that should be in better shape than either of them had realized under the dust. It wasn't comfortable by any measure that word usually meant. But it was hers, and she arranged what little she had in it with the same quiet competence she brought to everything. The work continued. The days shortened as they moved deeper into late spring, which sounds like a contradiction, but on Black Pine Mountain meant that the light shifted earlier in the evenings, and the mornings got their coldness back after the brief warmth of noon. Rhett found himself adjusting his routine in ways he hadn't expected, not for her sake, exactly, or not only. More because the homestead had started to function differently, better, with 2 people operating it who both understood what needed doing and did it without waiting to be asked. He started talking more. Not about anything particular, just at supper, going over what needed doing the next day, or what he'd noticed with the livestock, or a fence repair that was coming due before the summer made the ground too hard. Most of its windows were dark. She'd respond with her own observations and occasionally a suggestion that he'd initially file away skeptically, and then implement 3 days later when he'd thought about it enough to realize she was right. He didn't always tell her that. She didn't seem to require him to. One evening she was sitting at the kitchen table after supper with the accounts he'd let fall behind nearly 8 months of records he'd been meaning to get to, and she was working through them with the same systematic calm she brought to everything. And he looked at her from across the room and had the specific uncomfortable thought that he had stopped thinking of her as a temporary arrangement somewhere around the 20th day without noticing it happen. He put another log on the fire and didn't think about it any further. 23rd day. Wade came up from town in the early afternoon, moving faster than his usual pace, and Rhett knew before the man even got off his horse that something was wrong. Wade had one expression for everything, a sort of baseline neutrality that he varied very little, and the fact that it had shifted at all was information. 2 men came into town this morning, Wade said. He tied the horse to the post and came to the porch, asking questions about the stage routes. Asking Denny Platt at the livery if he knew of any recent arrivals from Missouri. Rhett held very still. What'd Denny tell them? Nothing useful. Denny doesn't know anything useful. Wade looked past Rhett into the cabin, then back. They're staying at the Rowan Hotel. I don't know their names. One of them was asking about property, who owns what up in the mountain parcels. He paused. They're not subtle. Scouts, Rhett said, not asking. That'd be my Red. Lenora had appeared in the doorway. Rhett didn't know exactly when she'd gotten there. She had a way of moving quietly that he still wasn't fully accustomed to. She had heard enough. Her face had gone to that carefully composed stillness again, but her hands he noticed. Her hands had closed into loose fists at her sides. How long were they asking around? She said. Couple of hours, from what I could tell, Wade said. They left town around noon riding north, which, he glanced at Rhett. North. North is the mountain, Rhett said. North is the mountain, Wade confirmed. No one said anything for a moment. All right, Rhett said. He looked at Lenora. Go get that rifle from above the door and bring it here. She didn't argue. She was back in 40 seconds with the rifle and his ammunition box, which she'd thought to grab without being told, and set them both on the porch railing. You know how to shoot? He asked her. My father taught me when I was 12, she said, then spent 6 years telling me I'd held it wrong. A beat. I held it fine. There was something grim and brief in the way she said it that told Rhett volumes about the kind of childhood that particular memory came from. But this wasn't the moment for that. Show me, he said. She picked up the rifle, checked the chamber with the automatic efficiency of someone who had done it before, shouldered it, and dry-fired at the fence post across the yard. Her stance was decent, not trained, but not wrong. Her grip was confident. Her father, whatever else he had been, had at least managed to teach her that part correctly. You're dropping your elbow, Rhett said. I know. I always do, she adjusted. Better? Better. He took the rifle back. I'm going to show you the loading dark, and then we're going to go the loading properly, and then we're going to go over the angles from in this cabin. Wait, I'll stay up, Wade said immediately. He hadn't waited to be asked. That was Wade. He was constitutionally incapable of elegant sentiment, but showed up every time it actually mattered. You don't have to. I'll stay up, Wade said again. He said it the way a man says a thing when discussion is not the point. The two scouts reached the edge of the homestead property late that afternoon, which Rhett knew because he'd positioned himself at the high point behind the barn where he had a clear sight line down the primary approach trail. He watched them come. 2 men on horseback moving carefully, the kind of careful that isn't caution, but reconnaissance heads up, eyes moving, not talking to each other, reading the ground. He let them get close enough. Then he stepped out from behind the barn with his rifle at his side not raised, but visible, and said, at a volume that carried, You're on private property. They stopped. The horses shifted. One of the men, the larger of the two, with a flat-brimmed hat, pulled low, put his hand very casually near his jacket in a way that was meant to look accidental. Just riding through, the man said. There's no through on this property, Rhett said. This is the end of the trail. Where you want to go, you turn around and take the eastern fork half a mile back. He hadn't moved. He hadn't raised the rifle. He was standing with the particular stillness of a man who isn't afraid and also isn't interested in proving it. I'll tell you once more. The 2 men looked at each other. Some communication passed between them that Rhett couldn't read precisely but understood well enough. They turned their horses. They rode back down the trail without a word. Rhett watched them until they were out of sight. Then he stood there a while longer, because getting out of sight isn't the same as leaving, and he wanted to know the difference. When he came back to the cabin, Lenora was at the window. She'd been watching. They'll go back to whoever sent them, she said. Yes, he said, and tell them where I am. That's the likely shape of it. She turned from the window. In the failing light of the late afternoon, she looked not afraid exactly, but like someone who had just watched the last exit close behind her. Then there's no more waiting and hoping they don't find me. No, Rhett said. There isn't. She absorbed that. He watched her do it, watched the brief internal process of someone taking a hard reality and rearranging themselves around it. Then we need to be ready, she said. We will be, he said. He meant it. But he also knew, standing there in that cabin, with the darkness coming down over the mountain and 2 strangers riding back to report on what they'd found, that being ready and being safe were 2 very different things, and right now he could only promise one of them. The next several days had the particular quality of waiting for weather you know is coming. You can see it's building on the horizon. You can't hurry it, and you can't stop it. All you can do is put the horses in the barn and check the shutters and make sure you haven't left anything suicide you can't afford to lose. Rhett taught Lenora to shoot properly. Not quickly. He wasn't a man who believed in rushing instruction on anything that mattered, and this mattered about as much as anything could. They spent an hour each evening after chores, working through the mechanics until she could load, aim, and fire with the rifle without thinking consciously about any individual part of it, which is if its windows were dark, which is the only state of readiness that's actually useful when something real is happening. She was a better student than he'd expected. Not because she was gifted, she wasn't, particularly, but because she paid attention the way she paid attention to everything, completely, without ego, without the self-consciousness that made some people flinch at their own mistakes. When she missed, she noted what she'd done wrong and corrected it. When Rhett pointed out that she was pulling slightly left at the trigger, she stopped and worked on it until she wasn't, and she didn't get frustrated in the middle. "You're better than you think you are," he told her one evening. "You're teaching me to shoot, not to be confident," she said. "Those are different problems." He almost laughed. Not quite, but close. They went through the cabin together, and he showed her the angles which windows gave coverage of the approach trail, which gave coverage of the far side of the barn, where the blind spots were and how to account for them. He moved his own bedroll to the front room, so he was between the main door and the rest of the cabin. They worked out a simple signal system. 2 knocks on her door meant get the rifle and stay low. 3 meant come out. Wade came up each morning and stayed through the afternoon, which he framed as needing to help with the summer fence repairs, and which both Rhett and Lenora understood was something else entirely. They didn't talk much about what was coming, not because there was nothing to say, but because most of what could be said had already been said, and repeating it wouldn't make the waiting easier. Instead, they did what people in that kind of suspended tension tend to do when they're not actively panicking. They lived inside the ordinary. They did the work. They ate supper. Lenora continued working through Rhett's neglected accounts in the evenings, which she had taken on with a thoroughness that was beginning to reveal just how badly his finances had drifted, and she'd started leaving small notes beside the ledger, not criticisms, just notations, observations about where money was going and where it might go differently. He read them. He didn't say much, but he made a few of the changes she'd suggested. On the 28th day, 2 days before the original 30 were up, though nobody was counting that anymore, she came inside from the garden at mid-morning with her hands still dirty from the soil and stopped in the kitchen and said, "I want to say something." "But all right," Rhett said. He was mending a harness strap at the table. "I came here for the wrong reasons," she said. "Or not wrong exactly, but incomplete ones. I needed to disappear, and you were an available way to do that. That's the truth." "I know," he said. "I want you to know that it changed." At some point, she looked at her hands, then back at him. "I stopped thinking of this as a hiding place. I started thinking of it as," she paused, seemed to consider and discard several words before settling. "Mine, which isn't fair exactly because it's your home. But I felt it anyway." Rhett set the harness strap down. He looked at her for a moment, really looked, the way he'd been carefully not doing for about the past 10 days, because it led to thinking he wasn't ready to do. "It's not a feeling you need to apologize for," he said. She nodded, just once, and then she went back outside to the garden, because that's what needed doing next. And he picked the harness strap back up, and the morning continued. But something had been said that neither of them would be able to unsay, and both of them knew it, and neither of them was sorry. The 30th day came and went without anyone arriving, which was both a relief and its own specific kind of tension, the way the absence of the expected thing sits heavier than the thing itself, sometimes. Wade rode down to town that afternoon to check for any news. He came back at dusk with his expression set in a way Rhett didn't like. "Shaw got a response from the territorial office," Wade said. He dismounted and handed his horse off and followed Rhett to the porch. "They're sending someone. 2 weeks minimum." 2 weeks, Rhett repeated. "Shaw says to hold tight." Wade looked at him. "He also says the 2 men who were asking questions in town checked out of the Rowan Hotel 4 days ago." Rhett was quiet. "Checked out," he said slowly, "or left?" "Checked out," Wade said. "Paid their bill, took their things. And nobody's seen them since." "Nobody's seen them since," Wade confirmed. They stood there for a moment with that information. Gone was one possibility. Gone to make a report and come back with more people, that was the other. 4 days was enough time to reach a telegraph office, send word, and start organizing. It was not nearly enough time for anyone to have come from Missouri, not by horse. But men who were already in the territory, men who'd been waiting for the scouts' report, that was a different calculation, and entirely. "Tell Lenora?" Wade asked. "I'll tell her," Rhett said. He went inside. She was at the table with the accounts. She looked up when he came in, and whatever Chassis saw on his face made her close the ledger and put her hands flat on the table and wait, he told her. She sat with it for a moment. Then she said, "How long do we have?" "Don't know," he said. "Could be days. Could be less." She nodded, stood up, went to check that the rifle above the door was loaded, which it was. She'd started doing that every evening as a matter of routine. The way you check a door is locked before you go to sleep. She came back and sat down. "Then we should eat supper," she said. "Get some sleep. Tomorrow is going to be a long day, whether anything happens or not." He looked at her. She looked back at him. "You're not afraid," he said. Not accusing, just naming what he saw. "I'm terrified," she said evenly. "But I decided a long time ago that being afraid of something doesn't mean you have to act like it." She picked up her fork. "Eat, Rhett." He sat down and ate. Outside, the mountain was dark, and the pines moved in a wind that had come down from the high ridgeline. And somewhere below them, on a trail that would look different in daylight, something was almost certainly already moving. He just didn't know yet what form it would take when it arrived. He woke before the alarm. He'd set an old tin clock that had belonged to his father and kept time with more enthusiasm than accuracy, and lay still for a moment listening to the mountain. There was a particular quality to early morning silence up on Black Pine that Rhett had learned to read the way a sailor reads water. Most mornings it was full and soft and consistent, interrupted only by the usual things whined through the pines, a horse shifting in the barn, the occasional creak of the cabin settling against its foundation. What woke him this morning wasn't a sound. It was the absence of the right sounds. The birds that usually started up before first light were quiet, not sleeping quiet. Quiet in the way animals go quiet when something unfamiliar is moving through their territory. He was out of his bedroll and had the rifle in his hand before he was fully conscious of deciding to do it. He went to the front window and looked out at the clearing without moving the curtain. Dark still, but the kind of dark that was thinning at the edges. He could see the shape of the barn, the fence line, the beginning of the trail leading down the mountain. Nothing moving that he could see, but the birds were still quiet, and that meant something. He went to Lenora's door. 2 knocks. Measured. Deliberate. Pause of maybe 4 seconds, and then her door opened. She was dressed. She'd slept in her clothes, he realized, which meant she'd gone to bed prepared for exactly this possibility. She had the rifle. Her hair was loose around her face, and her expression was alert in the specific way of someone who has been lying awake for hours waiting for a signal they were hoping wouldn't come. He held up one hand. She nodded. She understood. Stay here. Stay quiet. Wait. He went back to the front window. The clearing was still. The dark was still thinning, and then he saw a brief, small movement near the far edge of the barn. Something that could have been a branch in wind, except there was no wind. He pulled on his boots, took his coat from the peg, and went to the back door. What he found when he came around the east side of the barn was Wade. Wade was on the ground near the feed shed, sitting up with one hand pressed to his left shoulder and the expression of a man who is in significant pain and is refusing to make noise about it because he understands the situation. His rifle was beside him, and there was blood on his jacket. And he looked up at Rhett with that baseline neutral face of his, now somewhat impaired by pain, and said quietly, "Got me on the way up." Didn't see him until he fired. Rhett dropped into a crouch beside him. "How bad?" "Went through. Hurts like you'd expect." Wade's jaw was tight. "There's at least 4 of them. I counted before I went down." They split. 2 stayed on the trail. 2 went around to the west side. Rhett processed that. The west side of the homestead was the far side of the cabin. The side with the kitchen window. The side that, if you were circling the cabin to come in through the back while someone responded to a gunshot at the front, the gunshot was bait. The realization arrived with the cold clarity of something that should have been obvious 2 seconds earlier, and wasn't. They'd fired on Wade to draw Rhett out, to get him away from the cabin, to leave it with only Lenora inside. He grabbed Wade's arm. "Can you move?" "Moving right now," Wade said, and proved it by getting to his feet with the contained, teeth-clenched effort of a man who won't be carried. Rhett was already running back toward the cabin. He heard the crash before he reached the door, the sound of wood giving under force, which meant the back door, or a shutter, and then the specific silence that follows a violent sound while everyone involved reassesses their situation. He came through the front door. The first man was on the floor near the kitchen threshold. He was alive but not interested in getting up. He was holding his right arm and making a controlled effort not to show how much it hurt him, and there was a rifle on the floor 3 feet away from his hand that was not going to get there on its own anytime soon. Mitspitz, Lenora was standing in the middle of the kitchen with her rifle raised and her elbow correct and her eyes on the back window, where the shutter was hanging at an angle from a single hinge. She had shot him. Not fatally, she hadn't aimed to kill. Or if she had, her aim had been somewhere below that, but she had shot him, and and she was watching the window because she already understood that there were more than one. Rhett had time to take all of that in over approximately 1.5 seconds before the back window came fully off its remaining hinge. "Down," he said. They both dropped. The shot that came through the window went over the kitchen table and buried itself in the wall above the fireplace with a sound like a fist hitting wood. Lenora was already moving, crawling left toward the kitchen counter, which gave her coverage, which was what Rhett had told her to do when they'd gone through the angles together. And he felt something complicated and quick move through his chest at the fact that she'd remembered it. He came up behind the doorframe and fired twice through the window into the dark outside, not aiming at anything specific suppression, buying time, making whoever was out there recalculate. Calculation outside took about 10 seconds. Then he heard footsteps moving around the exterior of the cabin, going right toward the front. 2 of them outside, 1 down inside, and Wade was somewhere behind him, wounded and managing. He did the arithmetic quickly and didn't love the result. "The front door," Lenora said from behind the counter. She'd done the same arithmetic. "I know," Rhett said. He moved toward it. What followed over the next several minutes was the kind of sustained, close chaos that afterward is very difficult to reconstruct in accurate sequence, because in the middle of it, no one is paying attention to order. They're paying attention to the next 3 seconds. Rhett knew there were 2 men coming to the front. He got there first and put himself beside the door frame rather than in front of it, which meant when the door came open, he was not where they expected him to be, which mattered. The first man through took a rifle stock to the side of the head before he'd fully registered that Rhett wasn't in the room's center. He went down hard and stayed down. The second man was faster and smarter and had held back by about 4 feet, which meant he had time to bring his pistol up before Rhett could fully pivot. They stood for a moment across the small front room with weapons aimed at each other in the particular frozen geometry of 2 people who understand that whichever one moves first is taking a significant risk. The man was maybe 35, hard-faced. The practiced look of someone who had been in situations like this before and arrived at them professionally rather than accidentally. "Put it down," the man said. "Not interested," Rhett said. From behind the kitchen door, which neither of them could fully see from their positions, there was a sound. Just a small one. The creak of a floorboard. The man's eyes moved. Just slightly. Just enough. Rhett moved at the same time Lenora came through the kitchen doorway with the rifle raised, and the fractured second in which the man had to choose which threat to prioritize was 1 second too long. Rhett closed the distance and took the pistol away from him by main force, which required a brief and inelegant wrestling situation that resulted in both of them against the back wall. And then Rhett had the pistol and the man did not. "Down," Rhett said. The man sat down. Lenora stood in the kitchen doorway with the rifle still up. Her hands, Rhett noticed, were not shaking. Her face was a controlled kind of pale that would probably hit her differently later, when the adrenaline was finished. But right now she was steady. "There was a 4th, she said, west side. "I heard him before this one came through the front." "Where's Wade?" Rhett said. As if on cunt side, 2 knocks on the exterior wall. Wade's signal. He was alive and on his feet, and had apparently managed, wounded shoulder and all, to deal with the 4th man in whatever fashion had seemed most practical to him. Rhett exhaled once through his nose. "Stay on him," he said to Lenora, gesturing at the man on the floor. She moved into the room and stood where she had clear line of sight, and he went outside to find Wade. Wade had the fourth man face down in the dirt near the water trough, with both of the man's hands secured behind him, a length of fence wire that Wade had apparently grabbed from the barn rail on his way past. Wade was holding the end of the wire with his good arm. His bad shoulder was bleeding through his jacket, and his face was the color of old pewter. How? Rhett says. He underestimated me, Wade said. He said it without particular pride or emphasis, the same way he'd say the north fence needs work, or we're low on salt for the livestock. We need to get you down to the dock. After Shaw, Wade said. Get Shaw up here before you move any of them. You want this done right. He was correct, and they both knew it. Rhett went inside and tied a man from the front room alongside with the wounded arm. There was a rope from the barn, because it was more reliable than wire, and he'd learned from Wade's example. The man Lenora had shot was pale and silent and trying very hard to maintain dignity in a situation that had stripped most of it away. The man who'd faced Rhett across the room was cooperative in the way of someone who has completed a rapid assessment of their options and found them limited. Lenora, once it was clear the cabin was secure, sat down on the kitchen bench and put both hands flat on her thighs and breathed carefully for a minute. Rhett watched her from the doorway. She wasn't falling apart. She was doing the thing where you acknowledge what just happened to your body without letting it make decisions for you. You did well, he said. She looked up. I was frightened the entire time. I know. You still did well. She considered that. Your voice, when you came through the front door and said down. I knew it was you by the voice before I could see you. Is that relevant? It settled me, she said. Yes, that's relevant. He didn't know what to do with that. So he went to the front porch and fired 2 shots in the air, the pre-arranged signal to anyone in Black Pine Crossing that could hear, which was their rough system for summoning help, since the town had no bell tower, and then he went back inside and started making coffee because there was nothing else he could do immediately, and people who had been in a fight needed something warm. It was a small and inadequate thing, but it was something. Marshal Shaw arrived with 2 deputies in under 2 hours, which was faster than Rhett had expected and probably represented something close to Shaw's maximum speed. He came up the mountain trail with the look of a man who has been woken before sunrise and is neither surprised nor particularly inconvenienced by this, because his career had been built largely on being woken before sunrise. He looked at the cabin, the broken shutter, the door frame with fresh gouges in it, the 4 men in various states of confinement. He looked at Lenora, who was sitting at the kitchen table with her hands around a coffee cup. He looked at Rhett. Anyone dead? He said. No, Rhett said. Shaw nodded once slowly, the nod of a man updating an internal ledger. Tell me, Rhett told him. Lenora added the parts he'd missed, which were accurate and specific, and delivered in the same bookkeeper's precision she applied to everything that required precision. Shaw asked questions, and they answered them. One of the deputies wrote things down. The wounded man received basic attention to his arm from the second deputy, who had apparently done some field medicine in a previous chapter of his life. When it was over, Shaw stood in the middle of the wrecked front room and looked at the ceiling for a moment in the way a man does when he's thinking something he hasn't said yet. These aren't Missouri men, he said finally. Rhett frowned. What do you mean? I mean they're from here, from the territory. Shaw looked at the man who'd faced Rhett across the room. I know that face. He worked for a hauling operation out of Colson Junction 18 months ago. Got let go. He paused. Rourke hired locally. He was already here. Or his money was. The significance of that settled over the room, which means, Lenora said slowly, he didn't send people from Missouri. He sent instructions. And money, Shaw said. Yes, he looked at her directly. It also means he's closer than you thought, or his reach is. Lenora absorbed that without visible reaction. Rhett watched her do it, the small internal recalibration, the adjustment of the picture she'd been carrying. Territorial men, Rhett said. 2 weeks, you said. I've sent another wire, Shaw said, explaining what happened here tonight. That should speed things. He looked around the room again. I'm taking these 4 into custody. They'll be held in Colson Junction. Our jail is inadequate. He met Rhett's eyes. I want you both in town. The homestead isn't safe while there's only 2 of you. 3, said Wade from the doorway, holding his shoulder. You need a doctor, Shaw said. After I see them settled, Wade said. Shaw looked at him for a long moment and then decided, correctly, that this was not an argument worth having. They went down to Black Pine Crossing the following morning. After Rhett had secured the homestead as well as it could be secured with its current shutter situation, Lenora brought the document box. She brought it in her lap on the wagon bench the way she'd been carrying it since the beginning, not clutching it, not nervous about it, just keeping it where it needed to be. In town, things had already changed overnight. News in small frontier settlements moves through its own channels, faster and less orderly than anyone plans. Most of its windows were dark, and by the time Rhett's wagon pulled up to the main street, it was evident that the story of the night before had reached most of Black Pine Crossing in at least partial form. He could tell by the way people looked at the wagon, and specifically the way they looked at Lenora. 2 weeks prior, those same people had been politely skeptical of the woman who'd arrived on the stagecoach to marry a reclusive mountain widower. The whispers had been the ordinary kind, but wondering about her motives, her history. She understood what she was getting into. Now, those same people were watching her step down from the wagon with the document box under her arm, and the looks were different, uncertain in a new way, like they were revising something. Mrs. Hargrove came out of the store before they'd tied the horses. She took one look at the state of both of them, Lenora's loose hair and road dust. Rhett's jaw set at the angle it got when he was running on no sleep and said, "Come inside, both of you now." She fed them without asking what they wanted, which was the right instinct, and she didn't ask questions until they'd eaten, which was also the right instinct. When Rhett explained enough for her to understand the shape of it, she nodded the way a sensible woman nods when a complicated thing confirms what she'd already been suspecting. "That girl worked like no one I've ever seen, Mrs." Hargrove said, looking at Lenora directly. "I told my husband so the first week. I said that woman is not here for a soft life." She poured more coffee. Whatever she came here for, she earned her place on that mountain. Lenora looked at her. Something moved briefly across her face that she managed barely to keep contained. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was level. "That matters more than I know how to say." The 2 weeks that followed were not gentle. They were the particular kind of difficult that wears on a person differently than acute crisis, the grinding tension of waiting for something large to arrive while trying to live normally inside the space before it. Shaw kept them updated when he had updates, which was not frequently enough to be reassuring, and more frequently than nothing. The 4 men in custody had, after some initial resistance, begun to provide information. Not much, and not out of virtue, it became clear that Rourke had been careful to insulate them from direct knowledge of his operations, using them as instruments rather than confidants. But they confirmed they'd been hired through an intermediary in Colson Junction. They confirmed the payment had been substantial, and one of them, the flat-brimmed hat man, who appeared to be doing arithmetic about his own legal situation, confirmed that the order had been specific: retrieve the documents, remove the woman, leave no trail. Remove the woman. Shaw told Rhett this in his office with Lenora present, and he used those exact words, which Rhett appreciated even though it made something cold move through his chest. He looked at Lenora when Shaw said it. She was looking at Shaw, her expression measured and still, and he could see her processing it, taking the confirmation of exactly what she'd already known, and filing it in the place where she kept hard things. "He'll come himself now," she said when Shaw finished. "He won't trust another intermediary after this." "That's my read too," Shaw said. "When the territorial men arrive, they'll have authority to act on the evidence," Shaw said. "And I'll have authority to arrest anyone who comes in Black Pine Crossing with hostile intent." He paused. "Rourke coming personally is actually better for the case, if it comes to that. A man who sends proxies has distance. A man who shows up himself has none," Lenora finished. Shaw nodded. Rhett had been quiet through most of this. Now he said, "We need the town." Shaw looked at him. "If Rourke comes in with lawyers and money, and the confidence of a man who buys what he needs to find Black Pine Crossing standing behind Lenora. Not just you and 2 deputies. Rhett looked at Shaw steadily. "He needs to find a wall." Shaw was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You're asking me to help organize that." "I'm asking if you think it's possible," Rhett said. "The organizing is mine," Shaw considered. Drummed his fingers once on the desk. "Talk to Hargrove first. If Hargrove's in, most of the town follows." It turned out that Samuel Hargrove, who ran the general store, served on the town council, and was the kind of steady, understated man that frontier communities tended to build themselves around had already been asking questions after the night on the mountain. When Rhett came to him and laid out the situation in full, Hargrove sat with it for a while without saying anything. Then he said, "What does the girl need?" "Her name is Lenora," Rhett said, not sharply, just correcting it. "What does Lenora need?" Hargrove said. "Witnesses. People who've seen her here and know what she came to do. People who can't be bought out from under her." Rhett looked at him. Rourke is going to arrive with everything money can arrange. He needs to find something money can't. Hargrove nodded slowly. "I'll talk to some people." He did. Rhett didn't know exactly what Hargrove said to whom or in what order, but over the following 3 days, a quiet consolidation happened in Black Pine Crossing, not dramatic, not public, not announced. It was more like a collective decision, reached in small conversations between people who had watched Lenora arrive, and watched her work, and watched her help Rhett rebuild a homestead that everyone in town knew had been dying slowly since Margaret Calloway passed. One by one, in ones and twos, they told Hargrove they were in, whatever that meant when the time came. Lenora found out about it on the 4th day, when Mrs. Hargrove told her, and she stood in the middle of the store and didn't say anything for a long moment. "You don't have to do this," she finally said to Mrs. Hargrove, but she meant it for all of them. "No, Mrs. Hargrove agreed. "We don't." That was all she said about it, which was the correct answer. The territorial deputy marshals arrived on a Thursday, 2 of them, younger than Rhett had expected, with the clipped manner of men who worked inside legal systems rather than around them. They spent a full day with Lenora going through the documents, and it was the most Rhett had seen her talk in one sitting since she'd arrived. She took them through each entry with the same systematic precision she'd used with everything, and occasionally they'd ask her to repeat something or clarify a notation it's meant. And she'd explain it with the patience of a person who had organized this information specifically so that someone else could understand it. At the end of the day, the senior deputy, a man named Aldrich, with rectangular glasses and ink permanently on his right hand, looked at the stack of papers and said, "This is one of the most thorough private documentation efforts I've seen in 8 years in this office." Lenora said, "I had time and I knew what I was looking for." "You understood what you were looking at," Aldrich said. "That's different." He gathered the papers carefully. "We'll need to take these." "I know," she said. "I made copies." He looked at her. "Of course you did." Rourke arrived on a Saturday. He came with 3 men, not armed thugs this time, but a lawyer, an associate, and what appeared to be a personal assistant who carried a leather case with the practiced care of someone whose job depended on not dropping it. Rourke himself was perhaps 60 broad through the chest, with white hair and the kind of expensive clothing that functions as a statement about who has to accommodate whom. He walked into Black Pine Crossing's main street with the unhurried confidence of a man who has never arrived anywhere and found conditions unfavorable. Rhett was standing in front of Hargrove's store when he came in, which was not an accident. Rourke's eyes found him immediately. Then they found Lenora, who was standing 3 feet to Rhett's left. For a moment, just a moment, something moved across Rourke's face. Rhett couldn't name it precisely. Surprise, maybe, at the specific configuration of what he was seeing. He'd expected a frightened woman in a frontier town. He'd found a woman standing in the street of that town with her spine straight and her chin level, and a man beside her who was not planning to move. Rourke recovered quickly. He was good at recovering quickly. "Miss Bellamy," he said. His voice was measured and warm in the specific way of a man who has used warmth as a tool for so long he can deploy it automatically. "I've been concerned about you." "I imagine you have," she said. He let that sit for a beat. "I understand there's been some confusion about documents. Materials that were company property and appear to have been removed from company records." He smiled, the kind of smile that is not actually an expression of happiness, but a signal of social position. "I'm sure this can all be resolved simply." "It's already being resolved," Lenora said, "by the territorial marshal's office." The smile didn't waver, but something behind it did. "The records in question are currently in the hands of Deputy Marshal Aldrich," she said. "Along with testimony from 3 families your operation displaced, payment records showing transfers to 2 county officials, and copies of the original deeds alongside the forged versions." She tilted her head slightly. "Kept copies, Mr. Rourke. I told you 4 years ago that I was thorough. I assumed you remembered that. The silence that followed that sentence had a particular quality to it. Around them, and Rourke was now realizing this. Rhett could see him realizing it. Black Pine Crossing had arranged itself. Not dramatically. Not with weapons drawn or voices raised. But Hargrove was on his store porch. Shaw was beside the marshal's office with his deputies. Mrs. Hargrove and two of the other women from town were visible in the street. The Olsen brothers from the feed operation were by the livery. A dozen people, maybe more, positioned without apparent coordination in a loose arrangement that had the effect of making the street feel very small and very watched. Rourke's lawyer leaned close to him and said something Rhett couldn't hear. Rourke's eyes moved around the street once, taking inventory. Then he looked back at Lenora. "You'll regret this," he said. And he said it quietly, which was somehow worse than if he'd said it loudly, because it didn't sound like a threat in the conventional sense. It sounded like a prediction from a man who had made many of them and been right most of the time. "Maybe," Lenora said, "but you'll face trial. That's already decided." Shaw stepped forward from the marshal's office then, at exactly the right moment, and presented Rourke with the arrest warrant that the territorial court had issued the day prior based on Aldrich's preliminary review of the evidence. Rourke's lawyer made a noise of objection. Shaw looked at him with the particular expression of a man who has 11 years of experience with lawyers making noises. Rourke was placed in custody. He didn't struggle. He was too calculating for that. He looked at his lawyer and said something composed and quiet, and then he went with Shaw, and his boots on the boardwalk made the specific sound of a man who still believed he would find a way out of this, because he had always found a way out of everything. Rhett watched him go. Lenora stood beside him and also watched. She was very still. The document box was not in her hands. Anymore, it was in Aldrich's hands in a territorial office, and he realized she had nothing to hold. She was just standing in the street with her hands at her sides, and the thing she'd been carrying for 4 years was finally somewhere else. He didn't say anything immediately. There was nothing that needed to be said immediately. After a moment, she let out a breath. Just one long and controlled, and with a slight unevenness in it that told him what the steadiness on her face was covering. He put his hand over hers, just briefly, just for a moment. She didn't pull away. Around them, Black Pine Crossing returned to the business of being a small town on a Saturday, which it did with the quiet, unsentimental practicality of people who have other things that need doing but understood, without being told, that today something important had happened here. Rhett looked at the empty street where Rourke had been standing. Then he looked at Lenora. She had come west to survive. She had found something else, something harder to name and more difficult to hold on to, but more real than survival, by a considerable margin. And whatever happened next in the courtroom and in the territory and in the slow unfolding of a life being rebuilt from the ground up, it was going to happen with her standing in it. He didn't say any of that. He said, "You hungry?" She looked at him. And then, for the first time in a while, she almost smiled. "Yes," she said. "Actually, yes." They went to the diner. Wade joined them, his shoulder bandaged, and his arm in a sling, and his expression still maintaining its fundamental neutrality, and they ate a meal that tasted like nothing particular, and somehow like everything, and the mountain waited for them above the town, solid and indifferent, and theirs. The trial was set for 6 weeks after Rourke's arrest, which sounded like a long time, and was not. Those 6 weeks had a different quality than the waiting that had come before. The previous tension had been the tension of not knowing when something violent would arrive. This was something more bureaucratic, and in some ways harder to endure the tension of watching a legal process move at its own pace toward an outcome that was not guaranteed, while the man responsible for all of it sat in a territorial holding facility, with his lawyer visiting twice a week, and his considerable fortune working quietly on his behalf through channels that were legal and therefore difficult to stop. Rhett watched Lenora navigate this period and understood, for the first time, the specific kind of endurance it required. Fighting a man who sent armed people to your door was one kind of hard. Waiting while that same man's attorneys filed motions, requested continuances, and worked methodically to find procedural leverage that was a different kind, slower and more corrosive, the kind that wore on a person in the quiet hours when there was nothing to do but think, kept working. That was how she handled it. She came up to the homestead each morning. because they'd settled back into that rhythm after the excitement of Rourke's arrest had faded into the reality of what came next. The broken shutter had been replaced, the door frame repaired. The cabin looked, from the outside, almost exactly as it had before. Inside, it felt different in ways that were hard to specify, less like a place where someone was surviving, and more like a place where someone had decided, without making a formal announcement about it, to stay. The 30-day arrangement had never been formally concluded. Neither of them had brought it up again. It had simply become irrelevant in the way that provisional agreements become irrelevant when the circumstances that made them provisional have passed. She was here. He wanted her here. The mechanics of how that had happened mattered less than the fact of it. What they hadn't yet said out loud was the harder part. It was Wade who brought it up first, which was both predictable and surprising predictable, because they had no patience for things that need saying being left unsaid, and surprising, because Wade typically expressed this impatience through pointed silences rather than actual words. He and Rhett were mending the south fence on a morning in the middle of the 4th week, the kind of physical work that creates the conditions for saying things you'd avoid saying while sitting across a table from each other. Wade was managing the post driver with his recovering shoulder, and which he absolutely should not have been doing, and which Rhett had already mentioned once, and was not going to mention again because it would accomplish nothing. "You going to ask her?" Wade said. He said it the way he said most things, without preamble, without looking up from what he was doing. "Ask her what?" Rhett said. Wade gave him a look. The arrangement is done," Wade said. "Has been for weeks." "You know that. She knows that. Everyone in Black Pine Crossing knows that." He set the post driver down. "What nobody knows is whether you're going to do something about it or just stand next to her being grateful. Until one of you dies." Rhett tightened a fence wire without answering. "She's not going to wait indefinitely," Wade said. "Not because she's impatient, because she's sensible. At some point, a sensible woman decides for herself what her life is and stops waiting for someone else to define it for her. And then you'll have missed it." He picked up the post driver again. "That's all I'm saying." "That was considerably more than you usually say," Rhett observed. "I've been saving it up," Wade said. That evening, after supper, Rhett stayed at the table while Lenora cleared the dishes, which she always insisted on doing, and he always let her because he'd learned that insisting otherwise created more friction than it resolved. He watched her, and thought about what Wade had said, and about the 3 years of learning how to stop wanting things, and about the specific difficulty of unlearning that. "Lenora," he said. She turned from the basin, read his expression, set the dish down, and leaned against the counter and waited, the way she always did without filling the space. "The 30 days are done," he said. "They've been done for a while," she said. "I know." He turned the coffee mug on the table. "I've been not sure how to say what needs saying." "Then just say it without being sure," she said. "That's what I usually do." He looked at her for a moment. "I don't want you to stay because you're grateful I helped you, or because you're still hiding, even though you don't need to anymore. I want to know if you're staying because you want this. Specifically, this." He gestured at the table, the cabin himself, all of it at once. "Because I want it. I want you here. Not as a practical arrangement." He stopped. "I'm not doing this gracefully." "No," she said. "But you're doing it honestly. Those aren't the same thing, but honestly is better." She came and sat across from him. "Rhett, I stopped hiding 6 weeks after I got here. Maybe before that. What I've been doing since then is living. And I want to keep living here with you, because this is where I want to be." She met his eyes directly. "Is that clear enough?" "Yes," he said. "Good." She picked up the dish again. "Now help me with these." "You never help with the dishes." He stood up and helped with the dishes. Its windows were dark. They married on a Thursday in early autumn because Thursday was the day Marshal Shaw happened to be available, and the town's traveling minister was passing through that same week, which Lenora acknowledged was convenient timing without reading anything larger into it. Mrs. Hargrove cried, which she denied afterward while still visibly having done so. Wade stood beside Rhett in a clean shirt that he'd apparently owned for years and never found occasion to wear. The ceremony was brief and practical, and not particularly eloquent, which both of them found appropriate. Afterward, Hargrove bought a bottle of something he'd been keeping for a notable occasion, and people gathered in the street with cups and spoke quietly and laughed in the uncomplicated way. People laugh when something has concluded the way it should. Rhett stood beside Lenora in the late afternoon light and thought about the letter he'd almost not sent, the stagecoach he'd almost not gone to meet, the decision he'd almost made to send her back east. He thought about how thin those almosts were and what would have been on the other side of each of them, and he didn't let himself stay on that thought for long because it wasn't useful. She was here. That was what was useful. What none of them knew yet, what wouldn't become clear for another several weeks, was that the trial they'd been preparing for was about to become something considerably more significant than a local criminal proceeding, and that Rourke, in the 6 weeks since his arrest, had been doing what men like Rourke do when conventional options narrow, looking for leverage in the only place he had left to look. The trial began on a cold Monday in late October at the Territorial Courthouse in Colson Junction, 40 miles from Black Pine Crossing. Rhett and Lenora made the journey in the wagon the day before, along with Deputy Marshal Aldrich, who had become, over the weeks of case preparation, something adjacent to an ally not warm, not familiar, but professionally committed to the outcome in a way that Lenora had come to find steadying. Most of its windows were dark. The courthouse was larger than Lenora had expected, which was one of those adjustments you make when you've been living on a mountain for months and have recalibrated your sense of scale. She sat in the gallery on the first day and watched Rourke enter. He was suited and composed and wore his situation with the careful dignity of a man who understands that how he looks matters almost as much as what is said about him. His lead attorney was a man named Carver, brought in from a city practice east of the territory, who had the polished manner and the specific weight-shifting posture of someone accustomed to being the most formidably prepared person in any given room. Rhett sat beside Lenora in the gallery. He'd put on a clean shirt and his good jacket, and his jaw had the set it got when he was paying close attention to something and not planning to miss any of it. He watched Carver the way he'd watched the scouts on his trail, with the patient attention of someone mapping terrain before deciding how to move through it. The first 3 days were procedural. Evidence was entered. Aldrich testified about the document authentication process. 2 members of the Territorial Records Office testified about the methods used to compare the original deeds with Rourke's altered versions. It was methodical and necessary and not particularly dramatic, and Rourke sat through all of it with his hands folded and his expression of calm confidence maintained at the precise level required. On the 4th day, the displaced families testified. There were 3 of them: a widow from Caldwell County named Mrs. Prater, who had lost her farm of 22 years to a deed transfer she hadn't signed; a man named Delbert Oakes, who had been forcibly removed from water rights that had supported his property for a decade; and a woman named Ruth Sandoval, whose husband had died officially ruled an accident 3 months after refusing to sell his land to a Rourke acquisition agent, and whose testimony was the quietest and most devastating thing Lenora had heard in a courtroom. Carver cross-examined all 3. He was skilled at it, not cruel in the obvious way, but methodical in a way that was almost worse, finding small inconsistencies in memory and dates and worrying at them until the witnesses looked uncertain even when they weren't. Mrs. Prater left the stand, looking diminished in a way she hadn't when she arrived. Oakes was clearly rattled. Even Ruth Sandoval, who had walked in with absolute composure, was visibly shaken by the end. Lenora watched all of this from the gallery and felt something cold building in her chest that was not fear, but was related to it. She'd seen Rourke's methods at close range for 4 years. She knew how he worked. What she hadn't fully calculated was how well Carver would extend those methods into a legal context. After court on the 4th day, she sat with Aldrich in the small office he'd been allocated in the courthouse building and said, "He's going to come after me directly." "Yes," Aldrich said. He didn't soften it. "What angle?" Aldrich was quiet for a moment. He took his glasses off and cleaned them with the particular thoughtfulness of someone choosing words carefully. "Your father," he said. "The public record in Missouri includes his bankruptcy, the circumstances of it, the period of difficulty that followed." He put his glasses back on. "Carver will argue that a woman raised in an unstable household, who left under disputed circumstances, who traveled under an assumed name, that her credibility on financial records is compromised by her own history of deception." Lenora absorbed this. My father's failures aren't my testimony. No, Aldrich agreed. But Carver doesn't need to prove that. He needs to create enough uncertainty that the jury starts wondering. He looked at her directly. I want you prepared for it. Not alarmed, prepared. There's a difference. I know the difference, she said. She told Rhett that evening in the room they'd been given at the boarding house near the courthouse. He was sitting on the edge of the bed pulling off his boots, which was apparently something he did at the end of the day in a specific order, left then right, that she'd noticed without meaning to. She told him what Aldrich had said. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, What do you need? I need to know what I'm going to say when it happens. You already know what you're going to say, he said. You've known everything you were going to say since before you got on that stagecoach. You planned 4 years for this. Carver has had 6 weeks. She looked at him. I'm not trying to make it simple, he said. I know it's not simple. I know tomorrow, or the day after, he's going to stand up in that courtroom and talk about your father, and you're going to have to sit there and let him. I know that's going to be started again. I know what it costs when someone takes a wound that's already there and uses it against you. His voice had something in it that was personal, and she knew he was thinking about Margaret and about the years of people in Black Pine Crossing who had meant well and said the wrong things and reopened things he'd been trying to close. Cost differently than new wounds. But Lenora, your father's life didn't make Rourke innocent. Whatever Carver says about it, that's the truth, and you know it. And when you're standing in that box, you hold on to that sentence. She was quiet for a moment. Your father's life didn't make Rourke innocent, she repeated. Not a question, just holding the shape of it. No, Rhett said. It didn't. She nodded once. Then she said thank you, and she meant it in more directions than the sentence usually traveled. Lenora took the stand on the 6th day. Aldrich walked her through the documents, first entry by entry, date by date, and she answered with the same systematic precision she'd brought to everything from the beginning, the voice of a person who had not invented this information but recorded it, who had not constructed a case but simply observed and documented what was true. The jury watched her with the careful attention of people trying to decide whether to believe what they were hearing, and she watched them back without looking away because she'd learned long before this courtroom didn't like uncertainty even when it was only politeness. Carver began his cross-examination after the noon recess. He started where Aldrich had said he would start: the travel records, the assumed name, the departure from Missouri without notice. He built the picture methodically: a woman who left suddenly, who hid her destination, who used deception. He let each point land before moving to the next, which was a technique designed to accumulate effect rather than make any single devastating blow. Lenora answered each question with the same controlled precision. Yes, she had used her mother's name on the train manifest, because she had reason to fear for her safety. Yes, she had left without notice, because the alternative was remaining in a situation where she had witnessed serious criminal activity by her employer. Carver let a beat pass. Then he shifted. He asked about her father. He did it carefully, professionally inquiring about her background, her upbringing, the financial circumstances of her family of origin. He entered into the record the bankruptcy filing, the public nature of her father's decline, the period of what he termed family instability. He asked whether her father had been known for unreliable conduct, whether his reputation in their community had been compromised. Lenora answered each question. Yes, her father had struggled with alcohol. Yes, his financial decisions had been poor. Yes, the family had gone through significant difficulty. Carver nodded with the slow satisfaction of a man who has been leading someone exactly where he intended. Miss Bellamy, Mrs. Calloway, he said, correcting himself with the precision of a man who wants the jury to hear both names, given that background growing up in a household characterized by deception, financial mismanagement, and what you yourself describe as difficult circumstances. Why should this jury trust your account of complex financial records compiled secretly over 4 years? He let the question sit. The gallery was very quiet. Rhett in the second row was absolutely still. Lenora looked at Carver for a moment, just a moment. Then she turned to look at the jury directly, which was not what he'd expected her to do, and she said, because my father's failures are not my testimony. She let that land. Mr. Carver is asking you to doubt what you've seen: verified deeds, documented transfers, authenticated signatures because of who raised me. She kept her eyes on the jury. My father drank too much. He spent money we didn't have. He spent a great deal of my childhood telling me I wasn't capable of building anything meaningful. She paused. None of that changes a forged signature. None of it moves money from one account to another. His cruelty is not recorded in these documents. Augustus Rourke's crimes are. She turned back to Carver. My father's life cannot make this man innocent, she said. Ask me something about the records. The silence in the courtroom lasted long enough to become a sound of its own. Carver recovered, he continued. He was too skilled to let a single exchange derail him, and he pressed forward for another 20 minutes with the meticulous competence of a man who has been paid a great deal to be thorough. But something had shifted in the room, and both of them knew it, and it was not shifting back. The jury deliberated for 2 days, which felt longer than the entire preceding month. Rhett and Lenora stayed at the boarding house. They were not good at waiting, neither of them was, but they'd had enough practice by now that they could do it without making each other worse. They ate meals. Rhett fixed a loose hinge on the boarding house gate that the landlord hadn't gotten to because he was constitutionally incapable of seeing a maintenance problem and ignoring it. Lenora wrote letters to Aldrich, organizing documents for the post-trial process regardless of outcome, because organizing what could be organized was how she managed the things she couldn't control. On the evening of the second day, Wade arrived. He'd ridden the 40 miles from Black Pine Crossing, which was 40 miles on a recovering shoulder, because he had apparently decided at some point that the occasion required his physical presence. He arrived dusty and tight-faced and sat down at the supper table and ate 3 plates of food without explaining himself. And Rhett and Lenora were both glad enough to see him that neither pointed out he probably shouldn't have done it. "Town's thinking about you," Wade said when he'd finished the 3rd plate. "Hargrove said to tell you." Lenora looked down at the table for a moment. "Tell him we said thank you. He'll know without being told," Wade said. "But I'll tell him." The verdict came in on the morning of the 3rd day. They were in the courtroom gallery when the jury filed back in, and the room had the specific quality of air that happens in enclosed spaces where a large number of people are trying very hard not to make noise. Rourke was at the defense table with his hands folded, his posture still carrying the dignity he'd maintained throughout, though Lenora thought she could see, in the set of his shoulders, something that hadn't been there on the first day. Foreman stood, read the counts. Guilty. Guilty. 5 counts of fraud, 2 counts of conspiracy, 1 count of criminal intimidation. Courtroom erupted. Not dramatically, not the way it would have in a story that needed it to be dramatic. More like a room full of people exhaling at the same time. Noise, movement, voices at once. Rourke's composure broke for the first time, not into anger, but into a kind of rigid disbelief, the expression of a man who has believed for a long time in his own invulnerability and is now confronting evidence to the contrary. Lenora sat completely still. Rhett put his hand over hers. She turned hers over and held it. They sat like that while the room moved around them. She didn't cry. She didn't make any of the sounds she'd been quietly afraid she might make when this moment arrived. What she felt was something more like the conclusion of a very long physical effort, not relief exactly, but the absence of strain, the way a muscle feels when it finally releases from a position it's been holding. Her father's voice, which had been in her head with particular frequency during the trial, all the years of "you're not capable, you're not enough, you'll never build anything that matters," went quiet. Not gone. She wasn't naive enough to think it was gone, but quiet in a way she hadn't experienced in a very long time. The sentencing hearing was 2 weeks later, by which time they had returned to Black Pine Crossing and the homestead and the ordinary rhythm of life on the mountain. Rourke's received 12 years, not the maximum, because his attorney had managed to negotiate on 2 of the counts, which was a source of legitimate frustration. But 12 years in a territorial facility for a 60-year-old man was not a thing that could be reasoned into something minor, and the seizure of assets to compensate the displaced families which Aldrich had worked to secure in parallel was more substantial than Lenora had dared to calculate. Mrs. Prater's farm was recoverable. The deed transfer, ruled fraudulent, was reversed. Oakes's water rights were reinstated. The Sandoval family that received a financial settlement that would not bring back Ruth's husband but would allow her to keep her land and raise her children on it. Lenora read the asset distribution documents when Aldrich sent them and sat with them for a time in the kitchen of the cabin, at the same table where Rhett had sat with her box of evidence that night she'd been found out, in the same kitchen she'd cleaned on her first morning here, because the water trough needed scrubbing and she'd needed something useful to do. Rhett came in from the barn and saw her at the table and stopped. "Good news or hard news?" he said. He'd learned to ask first. "Good," she said. She looked up. "The families get their land back. Most of them." He sat down across from her. "That's what you wanted." "It's what I hoped for," she said. "I didn't let myself want it." She looked at the documents, then at him. "My father used to say that wanting things was the first step toward being disappointed by them. So I made myself stop wanting things." She paused. "I've been doing it for so long I almost forgot what it felt like to stop." "What does it feel like?" he said. She considered the question seriously, the way she considered most questions. "Like something just came back that I didn't know was missing," she said. He nodded. That was enough. He didn't need more than that. "There's something else," she said. "All right. Aldrich thinks the evidence I provided may open investigations in 2 other territories. There are simultatorins in the records, different names, different operations, but the same methods. He wants to know if I'd be willing to consult." She looked at him. "I told him I'd have to discuss it." Rhett looked at her steadily. "What do you want to do?" "I want to help." She immediately and without hedging. "I know these records. I know how he operated. If there are other families." She stopped. "I want to help. But this is your home, too. And if it means travel or time away or—" "Lenora," he cut through it, not unkindly. "Tell Aldrich yes." She looked at him. "You carried those records for 4 years," he said. "You crossed 1,000 miles. You stood up in that courtroom and you didn't break." He met her eyes. "Do you think I'm going to be the reason you stop now?" A silence longer than usual. "Then no," she said quietly. "I didn't think that." "Then tell him yes," Rhett said. "I'll manage the fence." She laughed. It was a real one, not the polite near smile she'd used in the early weeks, but the kind that comes out before you've decided to let it, brief and unexpected and entirely itself. He hadn't heard it enough. He planned to change that. The letter from her mother arrived 6 weeks after the trial concluded. Lenora saw the Missouri postmark and stood at the door of Hargrove's store, where the post was received, for a moment before she opened it. She hadn't written to her mother before leaving. There had been reasons for that, reasons connected to safety, to not leaving a trail, to the complicated reality that her mother had lived in her father's house, and therefore adjacent to his damage, and Lenora had learned early that telling her mother things too often meant those things eventually reached her father. The letter was 2 pages. Her mother's handwriting had always been cramped and slightly irregular, the handwriting of someone who hadn't been allowed to practice it much in school, and reading it was slow. Her mother had heard about the trial. Word traveled even to Missouri. She'd read what she could find. She said she was sorry, not elaborately, not with the kind of performed contrition that asks for something in return, but briefly and directly, the way a woman says it when she's been carrying it a while and has finally decided, saying it matters more than protecting herself from the response. She said she knew she hadn't protected Lenora. She said she knew that was a debt she couldn't repay. She said she was proud, and that word was underlined once, in the cramped handwriting, proud of what her daughter had done. She said she would like to write again, if that was acceptable. Lenora folded the letter, put it in her coat pocket, rode back up the mountain. She showed it to Rhett that evening without explaining it first, just handed it to him across the supper table. He read it. He was quiet for a moment, in the way he was quiet when he was deciding something. "What are you going to do?" he said. "Right back," she said, "I think." She'd been deciding this all the way up the mountain trail. "There's a great deal between us that isn't resolved. I don't know if it ever will be, but she's my mother." And she said she was sorry. She looked at the letter, which Rhett had set back on the table. "I've been the person on the other side of silence long enough that I don't want to be the one maintaining it." Rhett looked at her. "You could invite her to visit," he said. "Not pushing, just putting it there." "I could," Lenora agreed. She wrote back that same evening. It was short, not cold, but measured, the kind of letter that opens a door without committing to what's on the other side of it. She told her mother she was well. She told her she had married. She described the mountain in 3 sentences, practical ones, the kind that conveyed what life here actually was, rather than what it sounded like from a distance. She said she would be glad to hear from her again. She sealed it and put it on the table to go down to town in the morning. Rhett, who had been pretending to read an almanac on the other side of the room throughout this process, said without looking up, "That took you 20 minutes. It's a complicated letter," she said. 20 minutes is good. For complicated, he said. She looked at him, at the profile of a man reading an almanac with deliberate studied concentration that was fooling neither of them, and felt the particular warmth that had been developing in her chest for months, the kind she'd long ago stopped believing. She was the sort of person who got to feel. It wasn't the dramatic warmth of stories. It was quieter than that, more durable. The warmth of something built rather than arrived at. She went back to the letter and checked the seal on the envelope and decided it was fine. Outside, Black Pine Mountain was dark and cold, and full of pines moving in the early winter wind, and inside its windows were dark, and the almanac was burning, and was not being read, and a letter to Missouri was sitting on the table waiting for morning, and all of it, the entire ordinary specific weight of it, felt like exactly what it was. Home, not a hiding place, not a provisional arrangement, not 30 days of proving herself to a widower who hadn't been sure he wanted her here. Home in the full sense of the word, which is the sense that includes everything difficult about the place, along with everything that makes you stay. She blew out the lamp on her side of the table and went to bed, and the mountain held the cabin against the dark, the way it always had, solid and indifferent and entirely reliable, which was more than enough. The winter that followed the trial was the hardest one. Black Pine Mountain had seen in 7 years, which Rhett said with the authority of a man who had been keeping informal records in the back of his mind, since before he had any reason to track such things. The snow came early and came in quantity, and the trail down to town turned to ice by the 2nd week of November and stayed that way until late March, which meant that for nearly 5 months, the homestead existed in a particular kind of isolation that had nothing to do with hiding and everything to do with geography. Lenora had not experienced a mountain winter before. She had thought she understood what Rhett meant when he described it in his advertisement: the cold, the difficulty, the way the world contracted to the immediate and the essential. She had not understood. Understanding came incrementally through the specific education of waking, to find the water in the kitchen basin frozen solid, of learning how much wood actually needed to be cut and stacked before October to survive through April without crisis, of discovering that livestock in genuine winter cold require a different and more demanding kind of attention than livestock in the moderate seasons. She did not complain about any of it, but she did, on a particularly brutal evening in January, when the temperature had dropped to something that made the cabin walls contract and crack in the dark, say to Rhett across the supper table, "You could have described this more specifically in your letter." He looked up. "I said the winters were hard." "Hard is a word that covers a great deal of territory," she said. "Hard is a long week. Hard is a difficult task. Hard is not," she gestured at the window, beyond which the wind was doing something that sounded structural. "This. Would it have changed your decision?" he said. She considered this with genuine seriousness, because she considered most things with genuine seriousness. "No," she said finally, "but I'd have packed differently." He almost smiled. He was getting better at that, at letting the almost become the actual thing. It didn't happen every time, but it happened more than it used to. And she'd say that counting the improvement mattered more than marking the remaining distance. Consulting work for Aldrich began in the spring, conducted mostly by correspondence, long detailed letters in which Lenora walked through the patterns she'd identified in Rourke's records and explained how to recognize similar structures in other documentation. Aldrich had, true to his word, opened inquiries in 2 neighboring territories, and what he found there was both validating and disturbing. The methods were nearly identical, suggesting either that Rourke had exported his system or that men of a certain kind of ambition arrived at the same twine tools imbently when the law was thin enough to permit it. Lenora worked on these letters in the evenings at the same kitchen table that had become her desk and her workspace, and the place where she thought most clearly. Rhett would be reading or mending something on the other side of the room, and occasionally he'd ask what she was working on, and she'd explain it, and occasionally he'd offer an observation that was more useful than he seemed to expect it to be, and she'd incorporate it without making a performance of the fact that a cattle rancher with no legal training had just identified a gap in her analysis. He noticed she was incorporating it. He didn't say anything about that either. They had developed over the months a fluency in each other's silences that was more communicative than most people's conversations. In April, Aldrich wrote to say that the first of the parallel investigations had produced an arrest. A land broker in the neighboring territory with documented ties to two of Rourke's front companies had been taken into custody. The evidence Lenora had provided, specifically her analysis of the financial transfer patterns, had been central to building the case. She read this letter standing at the window in the early morning light with her coffee going cold, and Rhett watching her from the table. "Good news," she said. "It wasn't a question." "Tell me," he said. She told him. He listened. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "You know this is going to keep going." "I know. More letters. Maybe more travel. More of your time going somewhere other than this homestead." "Yes." She turned from the window. "Is that or you?" "I'm glad," he said. "I'm telling you it's going to keep going, so you don't feel like you have to apologize when it does. Which you'd do, you'd apologize." He picked up his coffee. "Don't apologize. Just do the work." Most of its windows were dark. She looked at him across the kitchen, this man who had written a practical letter asking for a capable woman, and gotten considerably more than he'd planned for, and who had, somewhere in the process, become the kind of person who told her not to apologize for being exactly what she was. She thought about the frightened widower who'd stood outside Hargrove's store with his hat in his hands, who had told her in the diner on that first day that he wasn't sure this was a good idea. He had become someone different in the specific way that people become different when they stop insulating themselves from the things that can change them. Not unrecognizable. The same fundamental man, the set of his jaw, the economy of his words, the bone-deep competence with which he moved through the physical world, but opened, somehow, like a window that had been painted shut for years and had finally been worked free. She didn't say any of that. She said, "Thank you," and meant it in the same multi-directional way she always did. And he nodded once in the way he always did, and they had breakfast. It was a Tuesday in late May when she realized she was pregnant, which she determined by the accumulation of evidence that a woman who has been keeping detailed records for 4 years is fairly equipped to recognize. She sat with the knowledge for 3 days before she said anything. Not because she was afraid to tell him, or not only because of that, but because she wanted to be certain, and because she understood, more clearly than she could have when she first arrived, what this news would mean to him specifically. Red had lost Margaret in childbirth. She had died on Black Pine Mountain in a winter storm when the doctor couldn't get up the trail in time, and the baby had not survived either. He had never spoken about it. In detail, she'd pieced together the shape of it from small things, from the way he went quiet at certain references, from the particular care he took not to discuss it directly. She knew he carried it. She knew it was the center of the grief that had turned him into the closed, isolated man she'd found when she arrived. She told him on a Friday evening after supper, when the dishes were done and the fire was settled, and there was no practical task standing between them and the conversation. She said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to let me finish before you say anything." He looked at her, set down what he was holding. "All right. I'm pregnant," she said. "I'm certain. I've been certain for 3 days." She kept her eyes on him. "I know what you're thinking. I know what happened before. I know this is going to be, I know it brings things back." She paused. "I'm not Margaret. The doctor in Colson Junction is closer than he was 7 years ago. We have time to plan, and I plan things carefully, and I am not going to let fear make this smaller than it is." She stopped, waited. He was very still. The fire popped. Outside, the spring wind moved through the pines in a way that was entirely different from the winter winds, softer, more provisional, like something trying out its strength after a long time away. He stood up, came around the table, crouched down beside her chair so they were at eye level, which was not something he typically did, and she understood that he was deliberately setting aside the height and the bearing and the whole physical grammar of a man who'd learned to present himself as impenetrable. "Are you all right?" he said. His voice was rough in a way she'd heard before in the middle of the night on the mountain when he'd come back to find her still standing after the attack. The voice of a man whose control is working very hard. Yes, she said. I'm well. I'm healthy. I'm more careful with myself than people usually give me credit for. She held his gaze. Are you all right? A long pause. Longer than most. I don't know yet, he said. I'll tell you when I figure it out. She put her hand against the side of his face. He closed his eyes for a moment, just a moment, and she felt the specific weight of everything he was carrying in that gesture, the grief and the fear, and underneath both of them, yet something else. Something that had been building for months, and that he hadn't yet found the words for. We're going to be all right, she said. She didn't say it to reassure him. She said it because she believed it, with the same careful conviction she brought to everything she believed. He opened his eyes, looked at her, nodded once. I'll ride to Colson Junction Monday, he said. Talk to the doctor about what we need to arrange. I already have a list of questions, she said. He looked at her for a moment. Of course you do. Would you like to see it? Not tonight, he said. He stood up, stayed close. Tonight I just need to... He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. She understood. Tonight was for sitting with it. Tomorrow was for planning. The pregnancy was not easy in the way that pregnancy in a frontier cabin at altitude is not easy, which is to say it was physically demanding in ways that had nothing to do with complication and everything to do with the reality that the work of the homestead didn't pause for it. And Lenora's idea of moderating her activity was roughly equivalent to a regular person's idea of working very hard. Rhett monitored this with the controlled anxiety of a man who has learned that telling Lenora to do less is approximately as effective as telling the mountain to be shorter, and he compensated by quietly taking on more than she realized it, until she realized it and told him to stop. And they argued about it twice, in a manner that was more direct and less polite than the careful navigation of their early months together, and also more honest. And afterward, both of them felt better, even though nothing was resolved. This, Lenora thought, was what people meant when they said a marriage was real, not the ceremony, not the arrangement. The moment when you're angry enough with someone to say the actual thing instead of the diplomatic version, and they're still there when you're done saying it. Her mother's letters arrived monthly now, regular as calendar pages. They were longer than the first one, tentative at first, then gradually less so, as though her mother was testing how much space she was permitted to take up. She wrote about Missouri, about the small town that had barely changed, about the women she knew from church, and the garden she'd taken over from a neighbor who'd moved away. She asked careful questions about the homestead, about Rhett, about the territory. She did not mention Lenora's father for the first several months, and when she finally did, it was in a single sentence he had died the previous autumn, quietly, in the manner of men who drink for enough years that the body simply stops negotiating with them. Lenora sat with that information for a day. She didn't grieve the way a daughter, who had been protected and loved, would grieve. What she felt was more complicated, a kind of finality, the closing of a chapter that had never had a satisfying narrative, the specific sadness of mourning not the man who died, but the father he'd never managed to be. She wrote back to her mother. She said she was sorry for her loss, because it was her mother's loss, even if it was not equally her own. She said she hoped her mother was taking care of herself. She said, and she meant it, having arrived at it slowly over the previous months, that she would like her mother to come west when the baby arrived. That she thought Black Pine Crossing could use her, and that she thought her mother might find something in a new place that an old one couldn't offer anymore. She showed the letter to Rhett before she sent it. He read it, handed it back. You're yes, she said. Then, are you? He thought about it with the honesty she'd come to depend on. I don't know her, he said. I know what she didn't do when you needed her to do it. But you know her better than I do, and you've decided. He looked at her. If you've decided, that's enough for me. She sealed the letter. Clara May Calloway was born on the 14th of April, which was a Wednesday, in the bedroom of the homestead on Black Pine Mountain, with the Colson Junction doctor present and Wade pacing in the yard outside because he had been told to wait there by Rhett and had complied with this request. In the way he complied with most requests, technically, while maintaining his own interpretation of its spirit, which meant he was outside but approximately 8 feet from the door, rather than at any reasonable distance. The birth was hard. Lenora had known it would be hard. She'd done enough reading, asked enough questions, prepared herself in every way that preparation was possible. Hard was still hard. There were several hours in the middle of it where the world contracted to a very small and very demanding set of requirements, and she met each one of them the same way she'd met everything else, with the particular stubbornness of a person who has decided that whatever is required of her, she will provide it. When it was over and the doctor placed the baby in her arms, Lenora looked at her daughter and felt something shift in her chest that was too large to have a clean name. Not joy exactly, though joy was in it. More like recognition. Like meeting someone you understand immediately, before they've said anything. Because the understanding comes from somewhere deeper than information. Clara was small and red-faced and extremely vocal about her opinions, and she had Lenora's dark hair already, in the fine quantity that some babies arrive with and others don't. Rhett came in when the doctor said he could. He stood in the doorway for a moment, just stood there, taking in the scene, and Lenora watched his face do something she had never quite seen it do before. He had the controlled expression he usually carried, but underneath it, something was moving that he wasn't managing to hold still, and his eyes were wet, in a way that he was very clearly not going to acknowledge, and that she was very clearly not going to point out. He came to the bed, looked at Clara. Clara, with the instinct of someone who has been alive for 40 minutes and already has preferences, was looking back with the unfocused but intense gaze of a newborn, discovering that the world outside is extensive and full of information. He stopped. Yes, Lenora said. She knew what he couldn't finish. He sat on the edge of the bed, very carefully, because Lenora could see him being very careful with the weight, with the motion, with all of it. She shifted Clara toward him slightly. He looked at her, then at the baby, then he took Clara with the hesitant precision of a man who has not held an infant in more years than he wants to count, and is afraid of doing it wrong. Clara, to her credit, did not make this difficult. She settled against Rhett's chest with the practical ease of someone who has evaluated the situation and found it adequate. He sat there with his daughter for a long time, without saying anything. Wade knocked on the doorframe eventually and said, "Everything all right in there?" Rhett said, "Yes," in a voice that was rougher than usual by several degrees, and Wade said, "Good," and went back to the yard. Lenora's mother arrived in June, 6 weeks after Clara was born, on the same stage trick coach from Colson Junction that Lenora herself had arrived on 2 years and several lifetimes earlier. She was a smaller woman than Lenora had somehow expected, or maybe she'd always been this size, and something about the distance and the years and the accumulated weight of memory had made her larger in Lenora's mind than she was in person. Her name was Agnes, and she stepped off the stagecoach with the look of a woman who has spent a long preparing herself for whatever she finds at the end of it and is committed to managing whatever that turns out to be. Lejoris was waiting at the bottom of the steps. They looked at each other for a moment in the particular way of two people who have a great deal to account for and have decided, without discussing it, to set most of it aside for now. Agnes said, "Let me see her." Lenora turned and took Clara from Rhett, who was standing a few feet back with the expression of a man who understands that some things are not his to be part of. She handed her daughter to her mother. Agnes held Clara and looked at her for a long moment without speaking, and her face did something complicated and private that Lenora looked away from out of an instinct for courtesy. When she looked back, her mother's eyes were wet, but she was composed, the specific composure of a woman who has lived a long time inside difficulty and has learned to hold herself upright even when she's undone. "She looks like you did," Agnes said, "at this age." "So I'm told," Lenora said. She hadn't been told. Actually, there had been no one to tell her, but the sentence needed a response, and that was the one that fit. They went up the mountain that afternoon, all of them, in the wagon. Agnes sat in the back and held Clara with the careful attention of someone who has been given something fragile and valuable and does not intend to be careless with it. Rhett drove. Lenora sat beside him on the bench and watched the mountain come into view as they rounded the last curve of the switchback trail. The cabin and the barn and the cleared land and the pines beyond, all of it settled into the afternoon light in a way that had become, over 2 years, simply what home looked like. Agnes stayed for a month. It was not an easy month, because the relationship between them was not an easy one, and proximity to someone you love and have not forgiven entirely is its own specific kind of work. They had conversations that were careful at first and gradually less so, moving toward the harder things in the way that two people move toward each other when they've decided the distance is worse than the difficulty. There were 2 evenings where Lenora said things she'd been carrying for years, and her mother listened and didn't defend herself. And on one of those evenings, Agnes said, "I was afraid of him." "I am not asking you to forgive that. I'm telling you it's true." And Lenora said, "I know," which was not forgiveness exactly, but was the beginning of the territory adjacent to it. When Agnes left, she held Lenora at the stagecoach, with the particular grip of a woman who has arrived at something late, but is not going to let go of it now that she has it. "Come back in the fall," Agnes said. "I know," Lenora said. She meant it as acceptance, and Agnes heard it that way, and the stagecoach took her back to Colson Junction and the rail line that would carry her to Missouri, and Lenora stood in the street of Black Pine Crossing and watched it go. Rhett was beside her. He didn't say anything for a moment, which was correct. Then he said, "You all right?" "Yes," she said, "and then it's strange. I spent years wanting my mother to see me clearly, and now she does, and I don't know what to do with that yet." "You don't have to know yet," he said. "I know." She picked up Clara, who had been sitting against Rhett's boot, with the contented focus of a 3-month-old investigating the texture of a bootlace. "Let's go home." The Bellamy Calloway Land Fund, which was what Lenora eventually called it, over Rhett's mild objection that his name didn't need to be on it, and her counter-observation that it was his land that had made everything else possible, and he didn't get to be modest about, that came into formal existence in the autumn of the year Clara was born. It was not a dramatic founding. There was no ceremony. What there was, practically, was a letter to Aldrich explaining what they intended to do and asking for his guidance on the legal structure, and a conversation with Hargrove about whether the Territorial Land Office would recognize their authority to file claims on behalf of families who couldn't afford representation. Most of its windows were dark, and 3 weeks of Lenora's careful bookkeeping applied to the question of how much money they actually had versus how much they needed. The answer to that last question was that they had less than needed and more than nothing, which was the condition under which most things worth doing begin. The first family they helped was a couple named Burkett, who had been served with a fraudulent evict notice on a water rights claim that had been legally theirs for 11 years. The notice had been filed by a land speculator from Colson Junction who had apparently calculated correctly that a couple in their 60s without resources or legal knowledge would not know how to fight it. He had not calculated on Lenora Calloway reviewing the filing and identifying 3 procedural errors that made it invalid before it had been in force for 2 weeks. The Burketts got to stay on their land. The speculator received a formal complaint from the Territorial Land Office. It was not dramatic. Nobody got arrested. Nothing burned down. The machinery of a small, quiet legal victory moved at its own pace, which was slow and occasionally maddening, and when it concluded, the Burketts sent a jar of honey and a handwritten note that said, in the specific unadorned prose of people who are not comfortable with grand sentiment, "We are grateful to you both." Lenora kept the note. She put it on the shelf above the kitchen table, where she could see it from the chair where she did her correspondence. The fund grew, the way things grow when they're rooted in something real, not quickly, not without setbacks, but with the particular steady expansion of something that has found its correct function in the world. Word traveled, as it does in frontier communities, through the channels of people who know other people who know other people, and the word that traveled was, there are people on Black Pine Mountain who will look at your papers and tell you honestly whether you have a claim worth fighting and help you fight it if you do. In its first year, the fund helped 11 families. In its second, 23. By the third year, it was handling cases from 3 territories, which required Lenora to hire a part-time clerk, a young woman named Polly from Colson Junction, who had been working in a surveyor's office and had the kind of mind that organized information naturally and precisely, the same quality Lenora had recognized in herself at that age, and to establish a formal arrangement with 2 attorneys in Colson Junction who agreed to handle filings in exchange for fees the fund paid on behalf of families who couldn't. Rhett ran the cattle operation, which had recovered from the years of decline before Lenora and was now producing adequately, not flourishingly, but adequately with the possibility of more. He was not involved in the legal work directly, except as a sounding board on evenings, when Lenora was working through a complicated case and needed someone to listen while she thought out loud. He was, it turned out, a better listener than she'd expected. He had the gift of asking the one question that shifted the angle, enough that she could see the whole picture differently. "How do you do that?" she asked him once. "Do what?" "Find the question." He considered this. "Livestock work," he said after a moment. "You spend enough time watching animals that can't tell you what's wrong. You learn to look for the thing that doesn't fit the pattern." He shrugged. "Same thing." She thought about that for several days afterward. It was, she concluded, a more sophisticated methodology than he gave it credit for. Established his own homestead on the adjacent parcel in the spring of Clara's second year. Most of its windows were dark, which he announced by appearing one morning with a deed, and the information that he had purchased the Hensley parcel to the north and intended to run it as a working cattle operation. When Rhett said, with the genuine surprise of a man who has been ambushed, "When did you decide this?" Wade said, "Been thinking about it for a while," which, in Wade's case, could mean anything from 3 weeks to 4 years. He also, within the year, married a woman named Frances, who had come to Blackside Cross to teach in the school that had been established the previous autumn, and who was approximately as different from Wade as a person could be. While still being compatible with him, she talked considerably, laughed easily, had opinions about everything, and expressed them without being asked, and seemed to find Wade's fundamental silence not frustrating but restful, which suggested they had identified the correct balance of energies. Lenora liked Frances immediately, which was unusual because Lenora did not tend to like people immediately. She liked that Frances said what she meant and meant what she said, and didn't dress either up in unnecessary fabric. They became friends in the manner of women who recognize something useful and real in each other and don't waste time on the ceremony of it. Clara, who by her second birthday was a person of considerable will and strong preferences, but attached herself to Frances with the specific devotion of a toddler who has decided an adult belongs to them, which Frances reciprocated without reservation. "She's going to be trouble," Frances observed once, watching Clara navigate a disagreement with a wooden horse in a manner that left no question about whose side she considered herself on. "She is," Lenora agreed. There was no apology in it. "She's also going to be extraordinary," Frances said. Lenora looked at her daughter, small and determined and absolutely committed to her position on the matter, and felt the thing in her chest that still didn't have a clean name, still too large for one, still arriving at unexpected moments with its full weight. "I know," she said. On the 5th anniversary of Lenora's arrival in Black Pine Crossing, which was a Thursday in late spring, Rhett came in from the morning chores and found the kitchen already busy. Lenora at the table with correspondence, Clara at the low table she'd been given near the window with the wooden animals she was extremely serious about, the smell of coffee and early cooking filling the space in the way it had every morning for 5 years. He stood in the doorway for a moment. He thought about the man who had written a practical letter on a Tuesday night at a table that needed books under one leg, in a house that smelled like cold ash and old leather and grief. He thought about standing outside Hargrove's store with his hat in his hands, braced for something he hadn't known how to want. He thought about the stagecoach and the woman who stepped off it without waiting for the driver's help and stood in the street Black Pine Crossing taking accurate inventory. He thought about the 30 days, the document, the night the cabin had come under attack, and the way her voice had been steady in the dark. He thought about the courtroom and the way she'd turned to face the jury and said, without flinching, "My father's life cannot make this man innocent." He thought about the letter she'd written to her mother and the way she'd sealed it and put it on the table with the finality of a woman, closing a door she'd been holding half open for too long. He thought about all of it. He did not think about what his life would have been if he'd gotten what he'd originally intended from that advertisement, a practical arrangement, a capable woman, no complications. He did not let himself think about that version because it led nowhere useful. But in the space where that thought would have been, he held a clear and specific gratitude for the way intentions are sometimes overridden by reality, and reality turns out to be better than what you planned. Lenora looked up from the table, read his face the way she read everything, with complete attention and without excess interpretation. "You're standing in the doorway," she said. "I know," he said. "Is something wrong?" "No," he said. He came in, poured his coffee, sat down across from her. She watched him settle, the specific way he settled when he was carrying something he was deciding to say. "I've been thinking," he said. "All right." "About what this—" He stopped, started again. "I wrote that letter because Wade told me to, and I was tired enough not to argue. I didn't want what I was asking for. I thought I needed a practical arrangement, and I thought I'd learned not to want anything more than practical." She was quiet, watching him. "I was wrong," he said. "About all of it. What I needed was—" He stopped again. He was not a man who found this kind of sentence easy, and she had never required him to. But he was trying today, and she could see him trying, and she let him take the time. "I needed someone who wouldn't let me stay where I was. And I needed to find out that I could still—" He looked at her. "That I could still be the kind of person who deserved something real." Kitchen was quiet. Clara had put down the wooden horse and was looking at Rhett with the earnest focus of a 2-year-old who has detected that something important is happening. Lenora put down her pen. "You always were that person," she said. "You'd just spent 3 years practicing being otherwise. That's charitable." "It's accurate," she said. "I'm a bookkeeper. I don't do charitable when accurate is available." He looked at her for a moment, and then he did something he'd learned to do more often over 5 years, something that had started as an almost and become the actual thing. He smiled. Not the controlled near expression of the early days. A real one. The kind that reached his eyes. Clara, seeing this, immediately reached her arms toward him with the peremptory confidence of someone who has decided this moment needs her participation. He picked her up. She grabbed his collar with both hands and informed him of something in the urgent, partially formed language of 2-year-olds that conveyed general importance without specific content, and he listened to it with the complete seriousness he brought to everything, which was part of why Clara preferred him for these communications. Lenora watched them and thought about what she'd been when she stepped off that stagecoach. Frightened, though she'd worked hard not to show it. Carrying 4 years of documents and a father's worth of damage, and the accumulated evidence that she was not quite what a respectable life required. She'd crossed 1,000 miles looking for somewhere to survive, and arrived by accident and necessity and the particular grace of a very specific Tuesday night letter somewhere she could live. She had not fixed everything. Her father's voice was not gone. It came back sometimes in the thin hours before dawn when the mind is not guarding itself carefully, telling her she was ordinary and insufficient and building something that would collapse. She had learned over 5 years to answer it, not with grand declarations, but with the specific evidence of the morning, the fund records on the table, the letters from 11 territories, the families on land they'd almost lost, her daughter's voice, her husband's hands, the mountain outside, holding everything up. The evidence was conclusive. The case against herself had insufficient grounds. Outside, Black Pine Mountain was doing what it did in late spring, the pines moving in the clean wind off the high ridges, the cleared land showing the bright new green of the season, the trail down to town, visible in the morning light like a thread connecting the homestead to the rest of the world it had been part of for 5 years now. Not an island, not a hiding place. A fixed point in a landscape that kept extending in every direction from it, carrying the name Bellamy Calloway out into territories that hadn't known either name before and would know both long after. The water trough was clean. The south fence was sound. There was bread in the kitchen and wood stacked for the season, and a daughter who had her mother's precision and her father's stubbornness in roughly equal measure, which was going to be either magnificent or exhausting, and was probably going to be both. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was in the specific and unromantic and irreplaceable sense of the word, a life. Neither of them had planned it. Both of them had built it, piece by practical piece, on a mountain that didn't care what they'd intended and turned out to hold more than either of them had known to hope for. And that, it turned out, was not a flaw in the plan. It was the only part of it that had ever mattered.